Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to our patch retrospect series. I know it's taking so long to get through it, but I keep having to make videos about other events and games, 16 FanFest, all that stuff. But you know what? We got plenty of year left, and the 10th anniversary is just kicking up this month, which was the whole reason we started this, to celebrate 10 years of A Realm Reborn. Well, I still got another 6 years of retrospects to go through, so I might as well get to it. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at patch 3.2, which was kind of an important time with Final Fantasy XIV. For those who may have watched my 3.1 retrospect, I talk about how the game had entered sort of this post-Heavensward Dark Age, where a lot of the content designed for high-end players was alienating middle-tier players, and there was no casual content for anyone to enjoy either. So it was really, really hard to stay dedicated online and actively participate in the game when it just seemed like everything didn't want you to do that. Well, patch 3.2 Gears of Change is actually called that for a number of reasons. One of them is that it's credited as the starting point for a new outlook for the dev team after a very rough last couple of patches post Heavensward's initial launch. Now, it is also, of course, a reference to some of the stuff that comes in the patch itself, some of the main story content, some of the raids that are in here, but all the same, let's talk about patch 3.2, what content it had, how it was received. You know the drill. So let's start with the MSQ. I mean, this is an obvious one, but I do like to do a few words about the MSQ in each of the patches. This actually has some pretty notable things. The biggest thing is that it is the precursor to 3.3, which was the end of the Dragon Song War. So there's a ton of memorable scenes, especially between certain characters and the growth that they have to undergo. The threat that Ishgard itself poses to the actual war with the dragons ending, which is still kind of a continuation from the patch prior, which did have some of that content as well. An important thing is that it introduces us to the Word of the Mother. It's Minfilia, the first time we've seen her after patch 2.5, and that is, of course, a factor that will carry into future content, as many of you know. That being said, it's not often an MSQ patch that's talked about because it is a lot of laying groundwork, and it's groundwork we didn't even know when or how it was really going to pay off. But there were a lot of really good moments, especially with one of my favorite characters, Thancred. He was all over this patch, and I think most people know one scene in particular. If you remember Gears of Change's MSQ, that was absolutely oof when it happened. In a good way, though. So, MSQ for 3.2, not much else to say. As for content, we had two dungeons, two that were really, really loved. One that had way more of a lifespan I think anyone would have given it credit for. Lost City of Amdapor Hard Mode. Now, the Lost City of Amdapor was a favorite dungeon when it initially came out. The Hard Mode, not as cool, but the Lost City of Amdapor has always been one of those kind of like Dark Souls-esque vibes, and a lot of people just instantly kind of get with it. The piano that's used in the theme, the kind of hopelessness of the area itself. Not as loved as the original, but still a really solid entry to the dungeon lineup. The other dungeon was the Anti-Tower, which has become such an important dungeon, I cannot overstate. It has been used for speedrunning, for relics, for all sorts of like going back and doing content kind of thing. It's just a dungeon that, because it's not very long, and the way you get through it is very straightforward and not too stressful on any players. It's just designed very segmented and well to just kind of pace yourself through it. It's remained to be a dungeon that whenever something needs to be grinded that could be done in old content, if Anti-Tower qualifies, it ends up being the go-to dungeon. So fun little tidbit for that one, but it's also just a really cool dungeon visually and the music and all that stuff. So definitely a fan favorite, especially from the Heavensward expansion. Now, the trial that was added in patch 3.2 was our first ever trial series. A Realm Reborn just basically looked at whatever avatars were in Final Fantasy XI and just did that for the most part, with a couple of curveballs thrown in. But by 3.2, with Sephiroth, which was the trial added here, we began our first ever trial series in that of the Warring Triad. Now, they started with Sephiroth, and this was very, very confusing. A lot of people who have played Final Fantasy VI, where the Warring Triad is from, and thus they are referencing, mostly know them by their other titles, the Fiend, the Goddess, and the Demon. However, they all did have names in the back end in the development that weren't really used in the games themselves. So, when we got Sephiroth as the Fiend, people were very confused because, of course, everyone went, Sephiroth is in Final Fantasy XIV now? Unironically, I have heard that so many times. And the devs kind of played into it too, because the achievement for beating Sephiroth on Extreme is actually Veni Veni Venias, which is the lyrics to One Winged Angel, or at least a part of the lyrics to One Winged Angel. They played into it, they had fun, but this was the start of our first ever trial series, and what a start it was. Sephiroth as a fight was a considerable step up. Even to this day is harder than the majority of the trials. It's just got a lot of damage. The ad phase was incredibly threatening with the way the tank mechanic worked there, the raid-wide AoE explosions given the tools we had at the time, and not to mention the second phase where you're fighting the giant one, and if anything goes wrong, if anything slips up, it can go sideways so quick. Especially because Sephiroth holds another important note. He would be the last trial with permadeath when you are knocked off. From 3.3 onward, that would go away. He held the title as the last one that had it, at least until the Unreal version came out, and they actually, did they undo? I think they did. I think they did. I think that was like a big note that they made. But it's been, yeah, I think so. They kept the knockoff for Titan. That's right, with Unreal. But with Sephiroth, no, they fixed it when it came around. But also, something else a lot of people probably remember from back in the day. Sephiroth's theme is kind of this like whisper metal in a lot of parts. And so one of it sounds like a song from Power Man 5000. And Power Man 5000 thought it sounded so much like one of their songs, probably the only song anyone ever knew from them, that they actually like publicly called out Square. And I think they said they were threatening like some sort of legal pursuit, because they were like, well, very clearly they're ripping us off. And Soken's like, I don't know who these guys are. So there's this whole random discourse that came from that. And yeah, it does kind of sound like the song for like one particular part, but then the rest of it sounds very, very original. So obviously that didn't really hold much water. A lot of fun memories from that fight, though. Still one of my favorite trials we've ever had to this day. And I was really happy to see it come back, pun intended, with Unreal a few patches ago. So that one's definitely worth checking out if you haven't done it. And then we go on into the raid. Now, after this, we can blast through a whole bunch of little things that are really important. But in terms of long-form story, the raid is the next thing we have to talk about. So I already mentioned how Gordius effectively destroyed the endgame raiding scene for its duration. 3.2 Gears of Change was supposed to be a different outlook. For Midas, they said they took a different outlook for how to do the raid. Instead of focusing on ultra tight DPS checks and, you know, really, really high-end gearing and making sure that like it was nigh impossible to do without a lot of gear and near perfect play, Midas was focused more on mechanics. They were going to come up with all of these very engaged and involved mechanics, and they absolutely delivered on that. It also famously brought about a few quotes. For one, we were told that Midas would be between the difficulties of second and final coil. I wonder to this day if that is a mistranslation, because it put both of them to shame 10 times over. It was nowhere near that difficulty. So with Gordius, the normal mode they promised was something like doing coil with Echo. That was way off. Midas Savage, they said, was between second and final coil difficulty. Way off. Don't know how that even came to be. But it was another tier of big problems in the raid scene. Now, anyone who was a hardcore raider will tell you Midas, despite a few bugs that happened, there were no bugs in Midas, another meme from the community, that it is one of the best raid tiers they've ever released. And honestly, I'm hard-pressed to argue against that. It has 4 good, fantastic, engaging, involved, and visually entertaining fights. I have 0 complaints about all 4 encounters in the Midas tier, and that is absurd. I can't think of any other tier where that is the case. So you know what? Yeah, it gets that if you're a hardcore raider. But again, if you were somewhere in the middle in terms of your commitment and skill difficulty, Midas was almost worse than Gordius. And I know that sounds crazy, but in Gordius, most people got stopped in the 3rd fight. In Midas, they got stopped in the 2nd fight. The 2nd fight, the Robot Gauntlet, is one of the most notoriously difficult things to have to prog through with having no idea of what's ahead of you than almost any other fight the game has released. Before and after, even I'd say Living Liquid, it wasn't so much that people couldn't figure out how to do it. They just couldn't meet what they needed to do in order to do it successfully. This was a non-stop disaster, and the groups that tried to get back together after Living Liquid fell apart on the second fight here. It got so bad that within, I believe, about a month, they nerfed that second fight. Yeah. That was one of the only mid-tier nerfs we've ever seen. In fact, it might be prior to 6.2, it might be the last time they ever nerfed something while it was currently active. So yeah, that's the kind of legacy Midas had. And once again, it ran the problem of being too much for a lot of people. Post-nerf, yeah, people could kind of work through the second fight if they hadn't already given up and exploded static-wise at that point. But the third fight was no joke either, and the fourth fight against Brute Justice is still notoriously called the game's first ultimate. And it's a title well deserving. It had a Savage exclusive phase that lasted about 3 minutes. All of the mechanics and checks are ultra tight. And the amount of healing it's just everything needs to be on point. And it's also, I think, like a really long encounter if memory serves. So again, fantastic fight, but for the state the game was in at the time, between this and Sephiroth, which is also still considered one of the hardest trials, for some people it was like the game stood still, because again, I haven't named anything yet that was good for the casual player or would be really engaging for them. So 3.2, it wasn't as bad. There are some things that happened across the patch that were good enough for people to kind of hang out, but it kind of perpetuated the issue. And, you know, we'll get to the point where it really changed at some point in this retro series. But as much as I love you, Midas, you are just as much a menace on the raid scene as your predecessor. So I'd say it, but still not in a great spot at this point. Okay, but let's focus on some of the things that aren't just content, aren't the hard content, because of course they do all sorts of changes and adjustments and stuff, and a lot of that stuff ends up having long-term repercussions. You know, job changes, of course, in that patch. As Heavensward was going on, they started taking the jobs that started Heavensward weak, and they just started kind of buffing them every patch. You know, they looked at Astro, they looked at Machinist, and they looked at TP costs, and they just started trying to adjust all that stuff. And 3.2 is a decent turning point. Machinist got a bunch of massive buffs. Astro got a few buffs that helped it out after some of the buffs it had gotten in the in-between patches. And all of that really began to help. You started seeing those two in a lot of groups, so they were already being used at this point and weren't really being memed on anymore. But the big thing that came out in terms of balance changes was limit break adjustments. They started adding punishment for stacking roles, jobs, or classes. Now, the punishment oftentimes would just, you know, be the slower generation, and we still deal with that nowadays. You know, if you've ever noticed that you just don't have LB and your comp has like double Black Mage or something, that's usually the reason why. But they also even added things like if you have 5 DPS, or if you have 3 tanks or 3 healers or something of that capacity. Basically trying to force standard comp so people couldn't try to force non-standard comps for, you know, higher end content. But that's one of the more important things that came out of that job changes wise. They also started adding a bunch of stuff to try to give new players tools to learn the game. And these are really important. These are something that they needed to do, and I wish they would honestly still put more effort into it to this day. The big thing was the Hall of the Novice that was added. Now, Hall of the Novice, as many of you know, is literally, you know, baby's first MMO. It teaches you how tanking works, how DPSing works, target swapping, healing, interacting with things on the battlefield. It teaches you all the bare bone basics before you go into your very first dungeons, and, you know, make sure you understand how those things work and what your responsibilities are. Not to mention, it gives you a pretty decent set of gear, and most notably, the brand new ring, which will boost your EXP all the way up to level 30 from all the monster kills that you do. I think it's just monster kills. Either way, it's an EXP ring that goes all the way up to 30, technically up to 31, and is very, very powerful as a ring. Most people will wear it all the way to 50, where they'll start replacing it with Tombstone gear and stuff. They also added Stone Sky C, which was a means of testing if you had enough DPS to kill basically a training dummy with a set amount of health. So they would give you, and this still is how it works to this day, they give you 3 minutes. You can do whatever you want. As soon as you start hitting it, you have to kill it before the timer is up. And it's balanced per job, per fight. Now, that being said, Stone Sky Sea to this day has often been looked at as the not always accurate representation of what you should be doing. It's become more so now because when you are like barely meeting the item level for Stone Sky Sea now with the way the game is balanced, you can sometimes just get screwed over by crit variance. It can actually be that bad when you're at low item level nowadays. But back then, it was just such a weird occurrence because what they expected from each of the classes and jobs was more wildly inconsistent. There were some times like where more was expected from a tank than another player that could do way more damage. Like it just didn't really make sense. The balance wasn't there yet for Stone Sky Sea, but I still think an important tool to have. It's a very clear indicator to a player that at the very least, if they were to play optimally, they could do it. However, people have often asked since the day of Stone Sky Sea coming out, if we could get a training dummy that actually fights back. That way you're forced to do something alongside hitting the boss in order to practice what is a more realistic gameplay of you needing to do a mechanic or needing to dodge an AoE or to switch to an ad or something like that. It's just individual things that can really affect the way that you decide to do damage for the rest of the fight. But you can't fault them for trying, and Stone Sky Sea is still a staple to this day for a very good reason. They also added the mentor system. Now, let me be clear. The mentor system as an idea and as what you should be doing as a player is a perfectly fine idea. Basically, players with a lot of experience and time playing the game who meet certain requirements can obtain a mentor crown, access a mentor roulette, and help out players that, well, need help. You know, it's a sign to say that, hey, ask this person a question, or if you see them in like a trial or a dungeon and you need help with something, they're supposed to be a beacon of knowledge and help. And honestly, it doesn't even have to be a beacon of knowledge. Like sometimes mentors don't know everything, and, you know, they can try to convey you the information or where to find the information. You can do any sort of thing to be a mentor and help, even if you're not all-knowing and omniscient. You know, no one expects that of everyone or anyone, really. Unfortunately, people just liked having a crown next to their name, and they still do to this day. And the system is very often ridiculed as a complete joke. I still ridicule it as a joke, knowing full well there are mentors out there really putting in an effort. I appreciate them so much because the name has been sullied and torn and tossed to just the wolves at this point. You know, I can't fault them for trying, but I'm not going to give them that many points for the mentor system. I'd rather abolish the whole thing and just, you know, be a decent person and help people out. I'd rather we not have a mentor roulette and we just have a I'm helping people roulette that isn't like mentor based at all, but that's just me. All right, now we can rattle off a bunch of other things that I had done. Some more standard stuff, some more patch specific stuff. They did do some adjustments to the diadem. I think I mentioned in the 3.1 video, I think I mentioned it in great detail, that the diadem was abandoned pretty quickly. This didn't help. Pretty much at this point, just gatherers would go into the diadem at all, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, no, this didn't help the diadem at all. No one cared about the adjustments they made to it. They made like getting flying faster, and they upped some of the rewards depending on the difficulty you queued in at, but it didn't. No one cared by now. They also added the Nath, the tribal quests for them. Pretty cool quest, pretty cool mount. But, you know, tribal quests, pretty standard at this point. It's nice to have, you know, the EXP that you get from them. Another option, you know, alongside the Vanu Vanu. So extra leveling stuff, always welcome. Oh, how did I forget this? I was going through all of these and I got towards the bottom. Actually, I know why it's down here. They added a new PvP mode. Their first attempt at kind of reinvigorating PvP, and that of the Feast. Now, the Feast has since been replaced, so many of you may not know it. But essentially, it is a mode where you go in, and when you kill an enemy, they drop medals. Everyone is holding a certain number of medals at the start. When you kill someone, they drop medals. And when you pick the medals up, you know, you take more damage, you become a more juicy target. But the idea is to either win the match by having the most medals at the end, or to get to a certain number of medals, and then you just instantly win the game. So it was pretty involved. It was pretty interesting. And when it first released, it was really, really popular. I did hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Feast matches because I loved it. I could queue with my friends. We could do group queues. There was even an 8v8 like deathmatch mode instead, which was honestly a very welcome change of pace of absolute chaos that I really wish we had in the game at this point. I love 8v8 modes, and I think the game should do more of them. But Like all PvP in 14, the golden days don't last forever. They started making changes that people weren't really super excited about. One of the biggest ones that they made was that they eventually, that's not in the .2x series, but I think by .3, they did something to it. You know what? Here's what I'll do. I'll leave this out so we can talk about it in that retro video. But yeah, no, the Feast, they just started making changes, making it less fun. And as much as they tried to introduce new maps that were more balanced, they were taking away old maps at the same time. It was just a mess. And, you know, as much as there were people who really, really liked it, there's also people who really, really abused it. You know, there were win traders, bots, all sorts of stuff in there. And they were rampant. It wasn't like a light thing. They were like rampant for a very long time. So Feast fell out of favor, and now it doesn't exist anymore. So nothing but a distant memory. But then there were a bunch of other things here. They had just introduced scripts in this expansion for crafters and gatherers, so there was a ton of quality of life to that. It took them pretty much all of Heavensward to nail down making scripts something that just felt like a basic endgame function for crafters and gatherers. It was something that was kind of difficult to engage with in the early days, but you know, they eventually worked through Heavensward and got it to a pretty decent spot. Ooh, a big one, the Orchestrion was added in 3.2. Yeah, imagine, we didn't have an Orchestrion up to this point. So that meant that now there was this whole extra collection thing, and people were trying to collect all the songs, you know, like the Triple Triad cards when they added that. So it was nice, and I think people love the Orchestrion to this day. You know, it's nothing like walking into your house or in room and just being able to crank up a tune that you have, or just to hear a tune that you've already got playing. So that was a very, very welcome thing. The Crystal Bell, which allows you to access the Esthetician from your in-room or your home, if you have it placed down. That was a very good thing. Ooh, retainers were able to upgrade from classes to jobs, so that was a nice thing as well. You could sell items, like vendor items, directly from your retainer, instead of going to your retainer to sell items on the auction, on the market board, and then going to a different NPC to just vendor items. You had to do that up to this point, but you didn't have to do that after 3.2. They made some UI size adjustments. They made some changes to target ground AoEs to make them easier to place. They even added the role waiting list for your duty finder queue to let you know like how long it would be, or how many spaces in front of you like every other role was, or you know, if you were a tank, how many tanks were in front of you in the queue. And then I just feel like mentioning it, the Adamantoise mount, because it spins and it's fun. Another thing I almost forgot to mention was the return of Hildebrand. Now, after his outing in A Realm Reborn, a lot of people in the player base wanted to see more, and the dev team wasn't really prepared for that. They had really just decided they were continuing something from 1.0 because it deserved to be continued, but that whether or not the character would continue to appear in expansions was dependent on the player base's reception to his adventures in A Realm Reborn. Now, there are definitely some slow points in there, a little bit of filler, much like a lot of A Realm Reborn, but it was popular enough to make him return in 3.2 and introduce a new beloved character into his little family, and that makes a whole lot more sense the later you get into the quests. Now, we can't talk about it too much because we are just doing the retrospect on 3.2, but in my opinion, the Heavensward Hildebrand quests were some of the best ones, especially by the time you get through the whole thing. If you skip through it to get to the more recent Manderville weapons, that is the one expansion I recommend you go back and play, because even if you're not a big fan of Hildebrand, there's some really great moments in there, truly. Hey, hi, Future Haps chiming into the previous video. While I was pretty content with everything that was in the 3.2 retro video, while I was editing it, I couldn't help but feel like something was missing, and that's because 3.25 has some pretty important things in it that I feel like have to be brought up when it comes to this retro style video. So I'm just interjecting and throwing a little bit of a bonus in here. Honestly, the big thing that I left out was the follow-up to the Anima Weapon quest, which was just light farming. Basically, you would go into instances, and upon completing them, you would receive a certain amount of progress towards the next part of your weapon. And every couple of hours, that value would shift between different instances, and it's very similar to something in the Zodiac weapon. This step was a far cry better than the previous steps, and thus was received a lot better and far more interactive. The light farming steps have always been kind of popular because people like to work together to find out what is currently the best light farm for the next 2 hours, and then group up and do those activities. And on top of that, they could still go through their other activities on any given day, any roulettes that they had, and still make progress. So this was actually a popular step, and still to this day is not a step you'll ever hear anyone look back on and complain. It's one of the easiest steps to get through if you were to do one now, and as such, I would have really liked to have had one in Endwalker, but I digress. That's a topic that's been beaten to death. Other than that, I did miss a couple of other things. The big thing was they added Chocobo Racing challenges and a whole lot of like end game Chocobo Racing related adjustments in patch 3.25. But other than that, I just wanted to interject largely with that animal weapon thing. So now I'm going to go to work on the 3.3 retro video, which was kind of what made me realize that I had missed those things in the first place. So enjoy that video when it comes out too, but finish this one first. Finish it. Now, there were tons of other little things, but as much as 3.2 touted to be the gears of change, it was really the gears of only a little bit of change. So unfortunately, we'll have to dive into what were the more positive changes that came after 3.2, because I will say it was a turning point for the better, at least I feel, for 3.3 and on. But anyway, that's going to be a wrap for this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And I will see you in the next patch retrospect. Hopefully have another one out this month, and maybe another two. Maybe we start blasting through these while we're in the off season for Final Fantasy XIV. Probably not a bad idea. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, take care.